What would you do if the very man the world had forgotten turned out to be the reason someone else survived? If a name whispered in a courtroom suddenly froze a judge mid-sentence and made him rise to his feet in silent recognition? This isn't just another story about petty theft. It's about how a single loaf of bread uncovered a buried legacy and reignited a nation's conscience. Let me take you back to the streets of Brooklyn, where a man no one saw and a name no one remembered was about to change everything. Brooklyn had a rhythm, fast, impatient, relentless, the kind of place where no one made eye contact unless they had to, and even then, it was often accidental. People moved with purpose, deadlines, groceries, subways, noise. But in that blur of motion, one man moved differently, slowly, quietly, as though the world was a place he was merely passing through. His name was Walter Grady, not that anyone called him that anymore. For most, he was just that guy, the one with the tattered army coat and silver-streaked beard that hadn't seen a razor or a kind hand in years. He carried a battered, olive-drab backpack, once standard military issue, now sun-bleached and unraveling at the seams. The backpack was his only companion, a relic of a life no one cared to ask about. Every morning, like clockwork, Walter walked the same 24 blocks of Brooklyn, not in search of anything grand, just empty cans, discarded bottles, anything he could trade in for a few cents. He knew where the bins overflowed, where the coffee shops threw out day-old muffins, and which bodegas were kind enough to leave out stale bread without asking questions. He never panhandled, never raised his voice, never asked for help, and because of that, people mostly ignored him. In a city overflowing with sound and need, silence is often mistaken for strength or irrelevance. But Walter wasn't irrelevant, he just refused to break. Underneath that weather-worn coat was a man who had once stood taller than most, a man who had led convoys through enemy territory, counted names during roll call, and carried the wounded through desert heat while gunfire cracked like lightning above him. Staff Sergeant Walter Edward Grady had served in the United States Army for more than 2 decades. He had deployed 3 times, twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan. He had driven supply trucks through ambush zones and loaded medevac choppers while mortars fell nearby. His chest had once borne medals. His hands had once been steady enough to disarm explosives. His voice had once commanded men. But that was another life, another man. The city didn't know his history. It didn't care. To them, he was just another body on the street, another failed citizen, another weight on society. What they didn't know was that Walter hadn't failed. He had simply given up, not because he was weak, not because he was lazy, but because the one person who made life worth surviving for was gone. Her name was Margaret. She had been the light in his life, bright, steady, the one who welcomed him home after each tour with open arms and soft music playing in the kitchen. They lived in a modest apartment above a hardware store, filled with secondhand furniture and framed photos from places he'd seen. She read novels, he listened to jazz. Their love was quiet, unremarkable to anyone else, but to Walter, it was everything. In 2007, she started complaining about stomach pains. The VA hospital said it was stressful, maybe a mild ulcer. They gave her antacids and sent her home. 6 months later, it was terminal cancer. By the time they caught it, there was nothing to do. She died within the year. Walter never forgave the system for that. Not the misdiagnosis, not the delay, not the sterile rooms where she faded away without even so much as a pain-free hour near the end. He sat at her bedside, held her hand through it all, and when the last breath left her body, something hollow took its place inside him. People told him to grieve, to apply for survivor's benefits, to speak to a counselor. He nodded. He even tried, but nothing helped. How could it? His best friend was gone. The only person who truly knew him, who knew both the soldier and the soul beneath the uniform, was no longer here to tell him he was still human. So one day, Walter walked out of their apartment, sold it, gave the money to a cancer charity Margaret had loved, and vanished into the noise of New York City. He didn't leave a note, didn't tell family. He simply disappeared. In the years that followed, Walter lived like a ghost in the city of millions. No address, no phone, no medical appointments, no benefits. He didn't trust the system anymore. The same institution that sent him to war had failed to keep the only promise he cared about, protecting the one he loved. People mistook his silence for apathy. It was grief, pure, unfiltered, unending grief. Still, Walter never descended into the chaos that consumed so many of his fellow homeless veterans. He didn't drink himself numb, didn't scream at the walls or chase hallucinations down back alleys. Instead, he survived on habit, order, the remnants of military discipline that still guided him, even if no one was watching. He picked specific doorways to sleep in, never the same one 2 nights in a row. He folded his coat under his head, kept his boots near him at all times, and wrapped Margaret's photo in plastic to protect it from the rain. He kept it tucked inside a sealed pocket of his backpack, next to his dog tags. Every night before sleep, he would take out that photo and whisper to her, "Almost there, Maggie. Just hold on a little longer." In the city that never sleeps, he existed in the forgotten hours, a living monument to a country that often left its soldiers behind. No one asked who he had been. No one saw the war still living behind his tired eyes. Until one day, a loaf of bread would change everything. Long before the streets claimed him, before the smell of trash bins and damp concrete became familiar, Walter Grady had worn a uniform, creased, polished, and purposeful. He had once stood in lines with other soldiers, saluting flags beneath blistering suns and distant skies. The military hadn't been a fallback for him. It was a calling. Walter believed in service, in order, in the quiet nobility of duty. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't seek medals, but his commitment ran deep-rooted in generations before him. His grandfather, a Korean War vet, his father, a Vietnam medic, who'd come home broken. Walter had promised himself he'd do it differently, and for a long time he did. He rose steadily through the ranks, not through charisma, but reliability. He was the man who never left the line, the one who remembered birthdays in the unit and noticed when someone's silence meant they were unraveling. Logistics became his specialty, not just supplying trucks and manifests, but keeping people moving when the world tried to grind them to a halt. In Iraq, he kept convoys on the road under fire. In Afghanistan, he ensured medkits reached the front lines faster than the bullets could find their targets. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't make headlines, but it saved lives. Every item, every truck, every delay avoided meant another chance someone got to go home. Then came the ambush near Fallujah in 2003. It was supposed to be a routine resupply mission. Walter was leading a convoy of 5 trucks loaded with medical supplies and fuel. The desert was quiet, too quiet. Halfway through a narrow stretch flanked by sand berms, the silence shattered. Rockets, gunfire, screams, overcoms. The first truck exploded, catching the second in flames. Walter didn't hesitate. He leapt from his vehicle, pulled 2 wounded men from the flaming wreckage, and commandeered a half-burning fuel truck that hadn't yet detonated. The medics were tracked behind it. If it exploded, it would take everyone with it. So he drove it, wheels melted, flames licking the cab, down a slope and away from the group. His arms were scorched by the time he leaped out, but it didn't blow, and 17 men were still alive. Later that day, during the evacuation, a young medic was hit. Shrapnel in his leg, lungs collapsing, chaos everywhere. That medic's name, Private First Class Michael Carmichael. Walter carried him on his back 2 miles to safety under active sniper fire. When asked later why he risked it, Walter shrugged. He was breathing, that was enough. Photos of the aftermath made the front page of the New York Times. Walter carrying a crying Afghan child during a separate humanitarian effort that same month. For a week, he became a symbol, the soldier who saved others no matter the cost. But symbols fade. The war dragged on. Names changed. Walter returned home. And for the first time in decades, he was lost. Civilian life was quieter, but disorienting. The structure was gone. Margaret became his lifeline, his compass. She knew when his mind wandered back to the sand, when the nights got long and the shaking returned. She'd touch his shoulder, bring him back. Always. They weren't wealthy, their apartment was modest, but it was theirs. And within its walls, Walter found peace. Until the pain began. Margaret never complained much. She thought it was just stress. She was strong like that. When she finally agreed to go to the VA hospital, Walter exhaled. thinking help was on the way. But the diagnosis was rushed. A mislabeling, they sent her home with heartburn pills and dietary advice. By the time someone took it seriously, it was stage 4. Walter sat beside her as the life drained from her day by day. He held her hand through the tremors, wiped the sweat from her brow when the fever hit, and whispered old army songs to make her smile softly, even when her eyes stopped opening. He filed all the paperwork, tried to claim the VA support he was told existed for veterans like him. But forms were returned with errors, offices lost his case, phone calls went unanswered, and then Margaret was gone. Everything else followed. The medals, the uniform, the folded flag they offered him, he left it all in a box at the cemetery, beneath her name etched in gray stone. He didn't want remembrance. A month after the funeral, he packed his bag, withdrew the last of their savings, and walked away. No more appointments, no more systems, no more identity. He shed Walter Grady like a snakeskin and became a nobody. And being nobody, as it turned out, came with a kind of brutal clarity. The streets don't pretend to care. They don't lie to you with brochures and hotline numbers. They offer nothing and demand you survive anyway. He adjusted. 3 winters in, he learned which subways stayed warm late at night, which parks police checked less frequently, which bodegas had employees with sympathetic eyes. But the VA never called. The pension never came. And each day, as his back grew more bent, as his legs ached from cold, Walter told himself, one more day, just one more, for her. Until one day, the hunger overtook the willpower, until one moment's survival demanded a crime, until a loaf of bread in a corner market became the turning point. A small act of desperation, a forgotten name, and a judge who hadn't heard that name in 20 years, until now. It was November when the cold returned like an old enemy, the kind of cold that made bones feel hollow, not just brittle. Walter had made it through colder nights before, but this time his body betrayed him. His lungs burned with every breath. His hands, always steady in the worst firefights, trembled from exhaustion. 3 days had passed since his last real meal. A handful of crackers from a generous busboy, half a sandwich from a passing stranger. Not enough. The morning had started like most others. He walked the route he'd memorized, recycling bins behind the theater, then the alley behind the Chinese takeout place, and finally the market, Morelli's Corner Market. He rarely went inside. The owner didn't like loiterers. Walter respected that. He never wanted to be seen as a burden, but that day the desperation outweighed the dignity. He waited until Mr. Morelli turned to help another customer. Then slowly he approached the bread shelf. His fingers hovered over a day-old loaf, dusty, discounted, forgotten. He tucked it inside his coat. Not hurried, not panicked. I just resigned. He turned to leave. Hey, stop right there. Mr. Morelli's voice boomed, his eyes locked on the bulge under Walter's coat. I saw that. Don't move. I'm calling the cops. Walter didn't run. He stood there in the narrow aisle under the harsh fluorescent lights that made everything seem harsher. I just needed enough strength to live one more day, he said quietly. By the time the police arrived, Walter had already placed the bread on the counter. 2 officers entered, one older, clearly used to this. The other, Officer Jenkins, young, fresh-faced, still carrying the weight of doing the right thing as it mattered. They patted Walter down and found nothing else, just a battered wallet, an expired veteran ID, and a dog tag chain with barely legible lettering. You a vet? Jenkins asked as he clasped the cold cuffs around Walter's thin wrists. Walter nodded. I used to be someone useful. Not anymore. Jenkins hesitated. Something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, regret, but training overrode instinct. The store owner's pressing charges, he said softly, almost apologetic. Says this isn't the first time. Walter didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply nodded. At the precinct, he sat through the process like he wasn't even there. Fingerprints, photo, forms, a blur of bureaucracy, a blur that Walter had long since stopped trying to navigate. A public defender arrived, tired, distracted, shuffling papers like they were cards in a game no one ever wins. Petty theft, prior incidents, no fixed address, we'll aim for time served, he muttered, barely glancing at the man in front of him. Walter didn't correct him. He'd forgotten what it was like to be truly seen. They gave him a court date, next morning, first on the docket. Until then, he'd stay in holding. That night, sleep didn't come. The concrete bench dug into his back. The room stank of urine and bleach. A flickering light buzzed overhead like an unkind memory. No one called to check on him. No one posted bail because no one even knew he was missing. He clutched the photograph of Margaret, hidden deep in his coat's inner pocket, protected in a plastic slip. He whispered the same promise he had made every night since she died. Almost there, Maggie, just a little longer. The morning sun spilled through the high windows of Brooklyn Municipal Court as Walter was led into the courtroom. Still in the same wrinkled clothes, still shivering from a night on concrete, his hands were free now, but his posture remained stooped, as if invisible chains still pulled at his shoulders. No one waited for him in the gallery. No family, no advocates, no friends, just lawyers preparing for larger cases, clerks tapping at keyboards, and a few reporters flipping through notes about more headline-worthy defendants. To them, Walter was a footnote. A case number? 47,293, State versus Walter Grady, the clerk droned. The young prosecutor adjusted his tie and stood with the precision of someone who believed in procedure more than people. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended after stealing a loaf of bread from Morelli's Market. Given his prior record and lack of residence, we recommend continued detention pending trial. The judge barely glanced up. Honorable Michael Carmichael, known for being firm, efficient, unmoved by theatrics. Mr. Grady, he said, eyes still on the file, how do you plead? Walter raised his head. Guilty, Your Honor, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. I was hungry. Someone in the back row snickered. A low, cruel laugh. The judge shot them a sharp glare, silencing the room. Then, slowly, his eyes returned to the file. Walter Edward Grady, former Staff Sergeant United States Army. The words trailed off. His eyes stopped moving. His fingers froze mid-turn on the page. The courtroom shifted. The air tightened. The judge looked up directly at Walter, and for a moment he said nothing, and he just stared. Then, in a motion so rare it stunned the bailiff, Judge Carmichael stood. The entire courtroom stilled. Judges don't stand for petty theft. They don't stand without reason. But this wasn't about bread anymore. This was about recognition. The judge's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the bench. He stared at Walter, back to the file, then again at the man before him. The same name, the same face, older, weathered, but unmistakable. The man who once dragged him out of the desert. Court will take a 15-minute recess, Judge Carmichael announced, his voice unsteady, barely masking the storm inside him. The defendant will remain. He turned and walked out, fast, almost too fast. Behind him, whispers exploded like sparks. But Walter remained still. He didn't notice the shift. He didn't yet realize that for the first time in 15 years, someone had looked at him and truly seen him, and everything was about to change. As Judge Michael Carmichael closed the door to his chambers, the noise of the courtroom faded into a distant hum, but the silence in the room was not peace. It was pressure, thick and rising. The name he had just read from the file echoed inside his skull with the weight of a buried memory finally unearthed. He moved quickly to the bottom drawer of his desk, a space reserved for things not meant to be forgotten but too painful to keep near. From the back of the drawer, he retrieved an old envelope, yellowed at the corners, soft with age. Inside it, a single photograph, long, untouched. 7 men stood in desert fatigues, dust clinging to their faces and sleeves, the sun casting hard shadows across the sand. They were younger then, leaner, eyes sharper but tired. In the back row stood a tall man with a steady posture and quiet strength in his expression, Walter Grady. And kneeling at the front, barely into adulthood, face pale and clenched with uncertainty, was Michael Carmichael himself. The image was more than a memory, it was a marker of survival. He had nearly died that day, Fallujah 2003. Shrapnel tore into his leg, gunfire rang out like thunder from every direction, chaos reigned. He remembered hitting the ground, unable to move, fear tightening around his chest like a rope, and then hands, strong arms, a voice urging him to stay alive. He hadn't seen the man's face clearly through the smoke and the blood. All he heard was a name shouted into the wind, Grady. Over the years, he'd searched records, calls, and old unit lists. But Walter Grady had vanished. No veteran benefits were claimed, no known address, no follow-up, just gone. Until now, the same man, older, gaunter, wrapped in a coat instead of a uniform, had stood before him in court, accused of stealing bread. And the system, cold and mechanical, had labeled him nothing more than a repeat offender. But he wasn't a criminal. He was the reason Carmichael was alive. The judge turned to his computer, logging into the secure military records database he still had clearance to access. His fingers moved quickly, but his breath was held the entire time. The name appeared. Service record after service record confirmed what instinct already knew. Walter Edward Grady, Staff Sergeant. 3 deployments, Bronze Star for Valor, Purple Heart, dozens of commendations for service and sacrifice. And then, in a mission report once classified, now quietly archived, was the line that froze Carmichael in place. During an active combat evacuation under enemy fire, Grady had carried an injured medic 2 miles to safety while sustaining injuries of his own. He had refused medical attention until the wounded were stabilized. The medic's name is Private First Class Michael Carmichael. The judge leaned back in his chair, hand covering his mouth, eyes closed for a moment too long. The courtroom image, the frail man in front of him, collided with the one in the file. The contrast was unbearable. Everything he had built, his legal career, his family, his purpose, had grown from a single moment of mercy on that battlefield, and now that very man had come before him, worn down by a system that had failed to remember him. This wasn't justice. This was a betrayal. He placed a call to the Veterans Affairs Office, requesting an immediate audit and verification. He didn't have the luxury of bureaucracy now. Every second mattered. Grady had to be seen before the system buried him again. Then he called an old contact, a fellow soldier, now a colonel, someone who had served alongside them both. The voice on the other end grew silent when he heard the name. And then came the response Carmichael needed. Action. He wasn't alone. When the calls ended, he sat motionless for a long time. The noise of the courtroom beyond his door had returned to its rhythm, but inside the chambers, nothing was routine. He pulled a fresh sheet of judicial stationery and began to write. A note that would accompany the court file. Not a declaration, but a reminder. Walter Grady was not another case number. He was not a trespasser or a thief or a man lost to time. He was living proof of a country's forgotten promise. Beside the letter, he placed a photograph of Walter carrying a child during a humanitarian operation taken by a war correspondent 2 decades ago, a moment of bravery that had once touched the nation and then disappeared like so many other headlines. He framed the image and set it beside his bench, visible to all who entered, a quiet monument to a truth that no courtroom had dared to speak aloud, that justice without memory is hollow. Meanwhile, Walter still sat in the courtroom, unaware of the whirlwind unfolding beyond the doors. He kept his gaze low, shoulders slumped, the weight of the years pressing downward like gravity on bone. He didn't yet realize that his name, spoken aloud, had shaken the walls of power, and that someone finally had remembered who he was. 15 minutes, that was all the recess had been. But in that short span of time, the trajectory of a man's life had been quietly diverted, rerouted from neglect toward recognition. When court resumed, the change was almost imperceptible, at least to anyone who wasn't looking for it. The courtroom staff had resumed their posts, reporters returned to their places, and the clerk called the next case with routine monotony. But at the center of it all sat a man whose name had ignited something far beyond paperwork and protocol. Walter Grady remained seated at the defendant's table, still in the same tattered clothing, still unaware that behind the judge's composed expression, something irreversible had begun. He didn't notice the photograph now resting beside the bench, framed and silent. He didn't know that his service record had been verified in full. He couldn't have known that just hours earlier, a phone call to a colonel had stirred old loyalties from the sand-choked corners of memory. Outside the courtroom, wheels were in motion. Colonel James Mason, a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Walter in the desert, was on the road, driving through heavy traffic toward Brooklyn. Uniform pressed, voice rehearsed. With every mile, he gathered the fragments of the story that had been scattered for years and prepared to speak them aloud, under oath if necessary. In the background, the Veteran Affairs Office had confirmed a devastating clerical error. When Walter had disappeared into the streets after his wife's death, a change of address form had gone unprocessed. The system, ever indifferent to silence, had quietly terminated his pension and medical benefits for no follow-up, no verification, just a file closed without ceremony. The money, 15 years of missed payments, remained unclaimed. The man himself was simply lost. Back inside the courtroom, Walter felt the old rhythm of the system settling in again. The judge's expression was unreadable, the young prosecutor ready to proceed. Everything on the surface looked like another petty theft case. A name, a charge, a sentence. Routine. But this time, the routine fractured. The judge announced a delay, a postponement, an investigation. Not a dismissal, but something had changed. For the first time in years, a space opened up. A pause. The prosecutor looked confused, but didn't object. Walter, accustomed to decisions being made without his input, simply nodded and followed the bailiff out of the room. The shift was subtle, but it had begun. That evening, the first ripple hit the surface. A local courthouse blogger, known more for snark than insight, posted a headline: "Bread thief claims to be war hero, judge takes unusual pause." The article included little more than speculation, but the comments section exploded. Some readers scoffed, calling it a sympathy ploy. Others, veterans themselves, felt the twinge of familiarity. Benefits denied, paperwork misplaced, years of service erased by a missed form. In the county holding cell, Walter barely touched the tray of food pushed through the bars. Hunger had become too familiar to feel urgent. The chill from the cement walls had settled into his bones. He sat alone, holding his dog tags in one hand and Margaret's photo in the other, protected in its plastic sleeve, corners worn soft by time. Her smile, frozen in the past, was the only warmth left. He didn't know that somewhere out there, someone had begun to say his name with reverence instead of ridicule. But the world hadn't fully changed, not yet. Later that night, a younger inmate approached him. The boy's jaw clenched as he held up a phone smuggled into the facility. On the screen, the same article. He had read the comments, the mockery, the doubt. Walter saw the anger before he felt the impact. The shove against the wall, the accusation of stolen valor, the bitterness of a brother lost in war, fueling rage toward a stranger who dared to wear a dog tag without honor. Walter didn't fight back, never did. He absorbed the hit like he had absorbed everything else: rejection, silence, the cold. His body had long since learned how to endure what his spirit couldn't afford to resist. Later, when the lights dimmed and the noise faded, he curled against the wall, holding the photo tighter, whispering an old promise beneath his breath, one even he no longer believed. "Almost there, Maggie, just hold on." But this time, unlike all the nights before, someone was finally listening. Someone had heard, and someone was coming. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Brooklyn was already buzzing, but this time not from traffic or the usual churn of city life. Something softer had stirred, a question, echoing in headlines shared across inboxes and coffee shop counters. Veteran or vagabond, the man behind the bread theft? Is what had started as a local court delay became a spark for something far bigger. The article posted the night before had been picked up by a regional news aggregator. A few editors saw the name Walter Grady and did what the courtroom had not. They searched deeper. Then they found it. Old military records, a grainy photo from the New York Times archives, a soldier, strong, alert, carrying an Afghan child through bombed-out ruins. The caption, Staff Sergeant Walter Grady, delivering hope in the shadow of war. Suddenly, the story changed. No longer a petty thief, now a question mark hovering over the American conscience. How would a man like that ended up here? Comment threads filled with competing truths. Some called him a fraud. citing how easy it was to fake ID tags. Others rallied in support, veterans themselves, recognizing the code in his silence, the discipline in his stillness. One comment read simply, "I know that look. We served with guys like him. No one pretends to be that quiet." Inside the holding facility, Walter remained untouched by the growing noise. His world was still made of cold floors and thinner breath. The bruise from the shove the night before throbbed gently beneath his coat, but it was nothing new. His ribs had known worse. His heart, too. He had spent years learning how not to hope. Hope, for men like him, had become a kind of enemy, offering just enough to hurt when it vanished. But outside, hope was gaining traction. At a Veterans Advocacy Center in Manhattan, a junior paralegal read the article and flagged it to a senior partner. Within an hour, a file was pulled. By mid-morning, Walter Grady's name was on the priority board at the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, a name not spoken in legal circles for over a decade. At the same time, Judge Carmichael was preparing for what lay ahead. He knew now that he couldn't remain on the case. The rules of judicial conduct were clear: personal connection, compromise, neutrality. But that didn't mean he would remain silent. As his assistant reviewed motions for the day, she noticed a new file placed atop her desk. No label, just a photo and a handwritten note clipped to it. The photo, Walter Grady, in fatigues, framed by a rising sun, leading a convoy through smoke. The note, penned by hand, carried no signature, just the words. Some heroes never asked to be remembered. She recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Colonel Mason. The message was spreading. Later that day, the courtroom transformed. What had been nearly empty the day before was now crowded with quiet anticipation. Journalists filled the press rows. Off-duty service members stood at the back, some in uniform, some with caps over bowed heads. They weren't here for spectacle. They were here for one of their own. Walter, escorted into the room, felt the shift immediately. Eyes looked at him differently, not with suspicion, not with pity, but with something gentle, like they were seeing him for the first time. He barely noticed the change in defense counsel. His court-appointed lawyer was gone, replaced by a man with silvered hair, a measured walk, and the calm authority of someone who did not need to raise his voice to command a room. The man introduced himself quietly, explaining only that someone had taken an interest in Walter's story. Walter didn't ask who. He'd stopped asking why years ago, and he simply nodded and sat down. Then the doors opened again, and the room shifted. 3 men stepped forward, full military dress, medals pinned, shoulders squared. Silence settled over the gallery. And behind them, walking slowly, was a man Walter hadn't seen in 2 decades, Colonel James Mason. Walter didn't react. His eyes flickered for only a second before lowering again. Recognition was a dangerous thing for men who had trained themselves to forget. But Mason saw him, and that was enough. Up on the bench, Judge Carmichael entered last. This time, when the bailiff announced his presence, the entire courtroom rose with more than formality. It was a tribute. A quiet one, unplanned, but sincere. Even those who didn't yet know the full story could feel its weight. The hearing began, but it was no longer about bread. The courtroom felt different, not because of any physical change. It was still the same beige walls, the same flickering overhead lights, the same polished bench where justice was meant to speak. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The air carried weight, expectation, reverence. Walter sat at the defense table in silence, unaware that his very presence had become a quiet reckoning for everyone in the room. Across from him, the man who now served as his attorney, Richard Harlow from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, prepared the day's filings with practiced precision. Unlike the public defenders of the day before, Harlow carried no trace of haste. His every movement was deliberate, like someone used to fighting for forgotten names. When the judge entered, the audience rose, not out of protocol, but out of instinct. Reverence rippled quietly through the rows of spectators, press, and uniformed soldiers who had taken time off duty just to witness what would unfold. But it wasn't the judge who drew every eye when the gavel finally struck. I think it was the man who stepped forward to take the witness stand. Colonel James Mason, older now, but still bearing the weight of command, approached the oath with the kind of dignity that needed no announcement. His medals caught the light. His gaze was firm. He had not come for drama. He had come for the truth. And the courtroom gave him its full attention. He began not with emotion, but with clarity. Years of testimony before military tribunals had honed his cadence to exact precision. He recounted the deployment to Iraq in 2003. He outlined Walter Grady's role in logistics and forward support. He detailed the ambush near Fallujah, the burning trucks, the chaos, the radio silence. Then, without pause, he described what Walter had done, how Walter had driven a flaming fuel truck away from his men, risking an explosion that would have torn them apart, how he had carried a wounded medic, Michael Carmichael, on his back through sniper fire and shrapnel fields, how, after it was all over, Walter had declined formal commendation, requesting instead that supplies reach a children's clinic outside Baghdad ahead of schedule. The room stayed silent, but it was no longer courtroom silence. It was reverence. The colonel didn't stop there. He produced a folder containing Walter's full military record, decorations, mission reports, and letters from former commanding officers. One of them, signed by a general now retired, described Walter as the quiet spine of every unit he touched. Another came from a now deceased medic who wrote that he owed his life to a man who didn't need orders to do the right thing. Then came the final blow, the quiet, damning evidence of systemic failure. Due to a clerical misstep during a 2008 database migration, Walter's military pension and health benefits had been suspended. Notices had been sent to a defunct address. There had been no follow-up, no home visit, no verification, just a digital expiration as if his service had been erased with a stroke of a bureaucratic key. Over 15 years, Walter had been denied nearly $250,000, 0 cents in financial support. Money owed to him not as charity, but as earned compensation for a life given to service. The prosecutor stood to object, but something faltered in his voice. The narrative had changed. This was no longer a theft case. It was a confession from a nation that had looked away for too long. The judge remained still, composed, but when he turned to Walter, something in his gaze had softened. It was no longer the gaze of authority. It was the gaze of memory. He asked Walter to approach the bench. Walter rose with uncertainty. His steps are slow and measured. The room quieted further. The judge spoke carefully, not as a jurist, but as someone who had once been on the other side of mercy. He acknowledged that the man standing before the court was the same man who had once carried him to safety, who had saved his life in the desert 2 decades earlier. It was a moment of unveiling, not just for Walter, but for everyone. The courtroom in that moment bore witness not just to a testimony, but to a transformation. A man once seen as disposable was now revealed as indispensable. A war hero misjudged by the world he had defended, the state, represented by a young, now visibly shaken prosecutor, formally moved to dismiss all charges with prejudice. It was not a victory. It was an overdue correction. The gavel fell. Walter Grady, once invisible, was now free. But the moment didn't end there. From the back of the courtroom, a woman stepped forward. Her coat was plain, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. She moved slowly, with the hesitance born of lost time. He reached him, and she spoke his name. Not like the court had, but with something deeper. Recognition. She was Margaret's niece. The one he hadn't seen in over a decade, the one he thought he had left behind with everything else. She embraced him, gently, but completely. And in that embrace, something long buried in Walter cracked open. For the first time in years, his arms didn't carry weight. They held a connection. And connection, after so much absence, felt heavier than any battlefield ever had. The doors of the courthouse opened slowly, but when Walter stepped outside, the world didn't move at its usual indifferent pace. It stopped. Just for a second, but enough. News cameras lined the steps, their lenses reaching like hungry eyes. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. But none of that reached him, not really. The noise dulled behind the roar of his thoughts. Years of being unseen now collapsing beneath the sudden weight of attention. Beside him stood Colonel Mason, tall and composed. On his other side was Judge Carmichael, no longer in robes, now just a man in a suit who owed his life to someone the world had almost let vanish. Walter had always known how to disappear, but no one had taught him how to re-enter. He wore clean clothes and donated that morning. A simple jacket, a pressed shirt, and slacks that didn't cling to his knees. His beard had been trimmed. His dog tags, tucked beneath the collar, now sat lightly on his chest, no longer worn like a burden, but like a badge. As they moved through the press, someone pushed through the crowd. A familiar face. Mr. Morley, the store owner? He didn't speak right away. His face, flushed and weathered, trembled with something deeper than embarrassment, shame. He had seen Walter as just another problem, just another case of trouble. Now, standing before him, he saw what he had missed. Morelli placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. No apology could rewrite the past, but the gesture, fragile and sincere, spoke louder than words. Walter nodded. That was enough. Within 48 hours, the story had gone national. Headlines spread across platforms no longer focused on theft, but on redemption. Forgotten hero found in chains of silence, the soldier beneath the stairs, the system that left him behind. A photo collage trended online. On one side, the iconic image of Walter in uniform carrying the Afghan child. On the other, a grainy shot of him hunched over, retrieving bottles from a trash bin. The juxtaposition struck a nerve, a truth too raw to ignore. By the week's end, a fund was established by a veterans' rights organization intended not just for Walter, but for those like him. Within days, the total surpassed $200,000, 0 cents. Contributions poured in from strangers, soldiers, students, and parents. Some donations were small, $5, $10, but came with messages. For my dad, who never asked for help. For the man I walked past every day and never saw. Walter was offered housing at a transitional veterans complex, but instead he chose Veterans Village, a small, quiet community in Brooklyn designed not just to house, but to heal. His apartment was modest, a single-bedroom unit with warm lighting and a balcony that overlooked a courtyard filled with benches and trees. He came little, but on the wall by the window he arranged 3 photographs. Margaret on their wedding day, eyes laughing. His old unit in Iraq, shoulder to shoulder beneath a burning sky, and one taken just days before outside the courtroom, him standing between Mason and Carmichael, a glimmer of peace softening the lines around his mouth. He didn't attend interviews. He turned down documentaries, but he accepted one invitation to speak at local high schools, not to inspire, but to explain. To tell students what service means when the world forgets, to show them that heroism is not a moment, but a weight some carry long after the medals are stored away. He didn't preach. He told the truth. That was enough. Each afternoon, he walked to Prospect Park. Sometimes he sat on the very bench where he had once curled up to sleep, wrapped in layers to fight the wind. Now he watched children play, dogs chase frisbees, and the elderly stroll in warm coats. He sat in silence, but this time it wasn't the silence of exile. It was contentment. Behind him, outside the courthouse, a bronze plaque was installed with little ceremony, no ribbon cutting, just permanent. Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten. Next to the words, a sculpture, a man in uniform carrying a wounded medic across the sand. The likeness was clear. It was Walter, immortalized, not as a defendant, not as a vagrant, but as what he always had been, a guardian. During the unveiling, the mayor quietly introduced a new legal initiative, the Grady Fund, providing pro bono legal defense for veterans facing homelessness or wrongful detainment. The goal was simple, to prevent another Walter. In a school across the city, a 10-year-old boy wrote an essay inspired by the story. It ended with a line that circled through online forums and later made it into a council meeting on homelessness reform. Not everyone in torn clothes is broken. Some people wear memories instead. Walter heard about the essay but never asked to read it. He didn't need to. At night sometimes, He would sit by the window with Margaret's photo in his hand, not crying, not aching, just remembering. And now, for the first time in years, he whispered something new, something lighter, something like a promise finally fulfilled. He had held on long enough. In battle, he was seen. 6 months passed. Winter had turned to spring, and with it, Brooklyn softened. Trees along the sidewalks shed their brittleness, children returned to playgrounds, and the city, in its way, began to look forward again. At Veterans Village, Walter had settled into a rhythm, quiet, deliberate, almost ritualistic. He kept his mornings simple: oatmeal, coffee, a short walk around the courtyard, and he spoke little, but when he did, the words mattered. He was not the kind to fill silence with noise. Silence had shaped him. Now it gave him space. On one wall of his apartment, framed photos formed a quiet altar to memory. Margaret's smile remained in the center. Around her, the past and the present circled in balance. His unit in Iraq, the sculpture outside the courthouse, a recent photo of Judge Carmichael's family, where Walter sat beside them at Sunday dinner as he had always belonged. He didn't talk about the court case unless asked, but he never avoided it either. For Veterans Day that year, he received an official invitation from Fort Hamilton, the first in decades. The envelope was formal, but the message handwritten at the bottom carried more weight than protocol ever could. They wanted him to speak, just a few words, a reflection. Walter arrived in uniform, the same dress blues he had once folded away after Margaret's funeral, cleaned, pressed. The medals, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons, glinted faintly under the early November sun. His gait was slower, but there was clarity in each step. He stood before a sea of young recruits and retired veterans, military families, and school children with flags tucked into their hands. A microphone waited, cameras hovered, but he didn't look at them. He looked out at the faces, the ones still serving and the ones learning what service meant. He didn't speak long. His voice was steady, low, and without flourish. He didn't talk about heroism. He talked about patience, about how kindness sometimes arrives late, but that doesn't make it less real, about how silence doesn't mean weakness, and how people can be lost in plain sight if no one dares to look. He ended not with demand, not with blame, but with a simple statement of truth. He had once protected the country. Yeah, finally, the country had remembered to protect him back. As he stepped down, something remarkable happened. The entire assembly, generals, cadets, civilians, stood in unison. No command, no prompting, a silent salute. One by one, hands raised to brows, eyes fixed on a man who had once walked among them, unseen. Walter paused, his back straightening slightly, and then, slowly, he returned the salute, clean, precise, familiar. His eyes, no longer dulled by weather and neglect, now held clarity. He no longer looked down when he walked. He no longer folded into himself when strangers passed. The shame, the invisible cloak he had worn for years, had finally fallen away. In the weeks that followed, Walter resumed speaking at schools. He never told the full story. Instead, he spoke about transitions, about what it meant to return to a place that no longer made space for you. His presence alone carried the weight of truth. Teenagers, especially the ones no one listened to, found something honest in him. He didn't lecture, he didn't warn, he shared, and that was enough. One day, while leaving a middle school auditorium, a student ran after him. The boy didn't say much, just handed him a folded piece of paper and ran off. Inside was a drawing, Walter in his uniform sitting on a bench surrounded by trees, and beneath it, in shaky pencil lines, "You helped the country, now I want to help people too." Walter kept the paper in the same drawer where Margaret's photo rested, not because it replaced her, nothing could, but because it reminded him that some things live on, in children, in silence, in the courage to wait until the world catches up to what's right. That spring, he returned to Prospect Park more often, not to scavenge or hide from the cold, but simply to sit. The same bench, the same trees. But now, when people passed by, they greeted him. Sometimes they sat beside him. Sometimes they just nodded. And sometimes, without saying a word, they left a folded note, a small flag, or a coin inscribed with the word honor. Walter never collected them. He simply smiled and left them there, letting the world do what it hadn't for so long. See him? By summer, Walter had grown used to the new rhythm, not of survival, but of stability. No more cold pavement beneath his back, no more rationing of cough syrup like currency, no more pretending he didn't exist just to make others more comfortable. Now, his days started not with uncertainty, but with routine. Morning coffee brewed in a small pot that sputtered like an old friend. A short walk through Veterans Village, nodding to neighbors who used to be ghosts in different corners of the same war. A bench in the courtyard where sunlight filtered through gently rustling leaves. The country hadn't become perfect overnight, but something in it had shifted quiet like the ground settling after a long winter. It started with the Grady Initiative, a national veterans legal support fund announced during the dedication of a new bronze sculpture outside Brooklyn Municipal Court. The statue, modeled after the moment Walter carried a wounded comrade through enemy fire, had no plaque listing his medals, just one inscription carved into the base: "Justice is remembering." Each year, the initiative pledged to review benefit terminations, fund pro bono legal defense for homeless veterans, and, perhaps most importantly, require that all court cases involving former service members include background screenings beyond criminal records. It wasn't a gift, it was a correction, and Walter knew better than anyone that corrections, however late, still matter. He continued to keep his life simple. He declined TV appearances, avoided political stages. He wasn't interested in being a symbol. Symbols fade. But he accepted when asked to speak at a small gathering of new recruits about to ship out. He stood before them in full uniform, not to tell them what to expect, but to remind them who they were. Not tools, not numbers, but people. He told them to protect each other, to write letters home, to come back whole if they could, and ask for help if they couldn't. When he stepped down, he didn't expect applause, but what came next was quieter and more profound. The youngest recruit, barely 18, stood and saluted without waiting for anyone else. Then the room followed. Walter had spent 15 years not being saluted once. Now, it happened not because of rank, but respect. Months later, at a private recognition ceremony, the Department of Defense awarded Walter a formal settlement for the benefits he had been denied. But he didn't keep all of it. He allocated a portion to a scholarship fund in Margaret's name for nursing students who agreed to work with veterans after graduation. He never said much about it. He just placed her photo near the envelope, as if finally delivering on a promise. As autumn approached again, Walter began a small ritual. Each Sunday after visiting the park, he would pass by the courthouse where everything had changed. He rarely went inside, but sometimes he would pause at the sculpture, watching strangers pause in front of it, reading, thinking. One afternoon, he noticed a young boy standing at the base of the statue, a school backpack sliding off one shoulder. The boy placed a paper at the foot of the bronze and stepped back. Curious, Walter approached when the boy had gone. The paper was a drawing, crayon on notebook paper. It showed a man in a military jacket handing bread to a child. At the bottom, it read, "Kindness is never too late." Walter smiled quietly to himself. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like he was remembering something. He felt like he was living something. The kindness that had once come too late had come all the same, and had waited just like he had, not to be thanked. I'll try to be redeemed, but simply to be seen. And now finally he was.